I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the show where we do not rejoice greatly. We cry into our beer, and we think about our mad world that even though we know it's mad, and even though we run something called the Disorder Program, we are caught off guard by the disordering events and actions that happen in the real world. That even though we thought, oh, there's a 51% chance Trump will become president, we didn't think it could be like this. We didn't think it could be such a landslide, such a repudiation of global order, such a reconfiguration along class and education lines of American politics, and such a conspiratorial attempt to take back control. I am feeling completely defeated, not only by being awake for 36 hours, but by a prospect of looking at a world that I don't know I really want to be producing content in or writing books for, because I don't see how they can have an impact. And we're going to try to unpack briefly what this means for the world. I am joined by my old friend, Sasha Polakow-Suransky, who you may remember from our episode on South Africa. He is the deputy editor of Foreign Policy magazine. He also grew up mostly in Michigan and is the author of Go Back to Where You Came From, a book about neo-populism and anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe over the last 5 to 10 years and the rise of the far right there and anti-immigrant sentiment. So he has a lot to say. And then after talking to Sasha, we're going to hear from hopefully a touch of Celtic optimism with Jane Kinninmont. Sasha, your first thoughts?
Well, I can't say that I'm surprised, but Trump's victory looks a lot more decisive than I expected. And his margins in some of the swing states, even if all the results aren't in yet, appear to be larger than what the polls suggested. So even if I went into tonight thinking that a Trump victory was a fairly likely outcome, it looks more convincing.
Yes, and this is an important point, because you might think, well, just being president is being president. But no, he didn't win the popular vote in 2016, and he didn't dominate the implications of the Senate and the House the way that the Republicans are likely to be now. So is this neo-populism unhinged and unbridled?
I don't know if I'd go that far, but what I think we're seeing is a widespread embrace of a lot of what Trump's selling. And I don't mean ideas when I say that. I don't think this is ideological. I think a lot of it is symbolic. I think a lot of it is people reacting to his political incorrectness, his willingness to transgress, his willingness to say things that other politicians won't say or wouldn't dare to say. And that was present in 2016. I think in 2020, there was a lot of anger over COVID. The dynamics were a bit different. Certainly after the January 6th insurrection, there was pretty widespread repudiation of Trump and disgust in a lot of quarters, even some of his previous supporters. But all of that's faded now. I think one of the things that people forget with elections is how short political memories are. And a lot of people are voting based on their economic circumstances in the last few months. And a lot of people just don't think about politics as much as we do.
100%. As you put it, while we were having our kind of watch party or wake, as it were, this was an election decided by the low information, low engagement voter, who they have certain grievances, and Trump's felonies and transgressions were not a detraction. They were actually what they actively voted for.
Yeah, I think that's true of some people. I'd be careful here to label people low information voters. I mean, sure, there are lots of people who made their decision in the last few days, people who don't particularly care about politics at all, but decide to vote once every 4 years. But there are people who are relatively high information voters too, who've supported him all along. And I think it's worth taking that into account. We're talking about people who are fairly wealthy, people who follow politics, people who actually like a lot of what Trump is saying. And then you've got people who aren't necessarily the most engaged voters, but have been completely battered by inflation and voted on that basis. And whether or not you think it's rational, we can sit here, expats in London, and say it's irrational to vote based on inflation or how much eggs cost now versus 4 years ago, and to blame that on Biden and by extension Harris. But that's how a lot of people think. People who are not doing so well, people who are struggling economically, they look at their bills, they look at how much they spend on gas or groceries, and that matters. And whether it's rational or not, they blame it on the sitting president.
Correct. And I can empathize with this anti-incumbent sentiment, what we've seen all over the world. People are frustrated. They feel the system doesn't work for them. They forget that Trump was the system, and part of the reason things are the way they are is because of all the spending that he did. But again, we need to not get too rational. This is the Disorder Podcast, after all. I feel that this is an incredibly disordering outcome, that the Western leadership that America has mostly exerted on the global system since 1945 is now largely over. And I also think it's disordering for global collective action issues on things like climate change and AI. How do you see where the international system deals with the pressing foreign policy challenges from Ukraine, NATO, Taiwan, the Middle East? Is there some hidden ordering principle that will come from this, or is it really just disorder?
I think it's too early to say, but I do think that things will be shaken up in the same way that they were after Trump's victory in 2016. I mean, I think one thing we're likely to see fairly soon is some sort of American pullback. And I don't mean withdrawal, I don't mean repudiation of NATO necessarily, but a very Trumpian gesture that we're not paying for you guys anymore. And that will lead to some policy decisions in Europe. And I don't know what they'll be. We might also see a more serious U.S. pivot to Asia, which would force some similar difficult decisions on European leaders, even if Trump doesn't overtly back away from NATO, but America's attention shifts east. That is going to force Europeans to think more seriously about collective defense. And I don't think it necessarily has to be imminent disorder, but I do think that the landscape will change and the truths that everyone takes to be self-evident to paraphrase, may not be for very long.
Yes, no truths are self-evident now. My fear about the Europeans, of course, it would be great if they, quote unquote, got their act together to more do their own defense. But they've had 4 years to prepare for a potential Trump second term. They've had more than a year where they understood that he might win. And they haven't really been able to step up in terms of preparing for the defense of Ukraine without American help. So let's just start there. Where is Ukraine and the issue of containing Russian aggression?
If I were Zelensky, I wouldn't be feeling very good this morning. You know, Trump has said pretty clearly, and again, we can't take him at his word, but let's, as an exercise, take him at his word here. Says, I'm going to end the war in 24 hours. I'm going to get them to sit down at the table. Trump aside, this is something that serious people have been talking about in the last few months. Should Ukraine go to the negotiating table? I think that's possible. The question is, does Trump give half of Ukraine on a platter to Putin? Or does he try to preside over a serious peace negotiation to come to some sort of armistice agreement? And does that actually hold? Or does it just freeze the conflict and allow Russia to gobble up a bit more of Ukraine a few years later?
I think that it's more likely the latter. I don't think that he has the nuance or ability to do that negotiation. But yes, of course, those questions are going to be large in everyone's mind. To pivot to a topic that you're quite expert on, yes, the economy and inflation was key, but I think probably what swung it is this anti-immigration sentiment that has gradually swept the West from here in England, stop the small boats and the fears about immigrants and Brexit. You were studying this phenomenon in Scandinavia and in Germany with AfD and Marine Le Pen for a long, long time. So How have you seen the kind of viral contagion of how this anti-immigrant far-right take back control of our borders movement has played out over the last decade and a half?
It's certainly driving his popularity. There's no doubt about that. I don't think the U.S. is exactly the same as any European country, but I think that the general mood is quite similar. And Trump has always made this a core issue. And he goes on and on about the border. You know, last time around it was build a wall. He hasn't been chanting that refrain to the same extent this time, but
he's chanting the refrain of mass deportation.
Right. And I think that, you know, with people like Stephen Miller and other advisors around him, there's a very real risk that he is going to try something along those lines. Whether he gets away with it, whether he actually manages the logistics of it is a separate question. But there is certainly less standing in his way this time. And by that, I mean the kinds of traditional Republicans, advisors, cabinet members who were in the first Trump administration. I just don't think you're going to see those kinds of people this time around.
Yes, there are almost no checks and balances now. What can we ascertain, though, from how those movements have played out? Because for me, it's shown that there are no solutions, so that the thing that the Svenska Demokraten or Marine Le Pen might say about immigration are actually not solutions. And the mass deportation idea sounds great to certain red meat constituents, throw them the red meat, but there's no solution here. It would tank the economy. We need these people to do all the lawn care and cleaning and daycare and senior care jobs. How can it actually be done? Or will it just cause disorder?
Well, I mean, it's not just about the economic impact. I mean, there's a moral question there, too, of kicking out tens of millions of people and separating families.
Of course, it's unconscionable. I mean, it's fascistic and unconscionable.
I don't think it's a solution. I don't think it's going to change much. It will be red meat to some of his voter base. But the other thing you see with a lot of these parties is that there are ebbs and flows. You know, Marine Le Pen has steadily improved her numbers in national elections, but her party underperformed in the legislative election that everyone thought they were going to win earlier this year. So it's not a given that even when some of these ideas and some of these politicians become very popular, that their agenda actually comes to fruition and they actually manage to do what they say they're going to do.
Correct. I don't think he can do what he said he's going to do. We mentioned foreign policy, and it would appear that this is not even in the top 5 issues that have driven, you know, why people have voted the way that they've done. It might not even be in the top 10, but certainly not in the top 5. However, you and I have a training in the foreign policy field, and we're interested in how foreign policy did, to some extent, guide voter choices. So does foreign policy matter to these voters? What was the way that it impacted the election?
I don't think it does in general terms. And I think people like you and me, Jason, you know, we do this for a living. We live and breathe foreign policy, and we just tend to assume that everyone else does too. But as you say, most people just don't give a damn. And they're voting based on immigration, on inflation, on the bottom line. There is one place where I think it did matter in this election. And I was looking at some numbers about 10 minutes ago. The final numbers aren't in yet from my home state of Michigan. I think when all is said and done, foreign policy will not be seen as the storyline of this election, but it may be to blame for Harris losing Michigan or losing Michigan by a sizable margin.
She's going to have lost Michigan by hundreds of thousands of votes.
Yeah. So again, we haven't seen the totals yet, but Wayne County, which is home to Detroit and Dearborn, looks like something like a 60-40 split at the moment, which is a very, very poor result.
Yeah, for Biden got over 70.
And there are 200,000 to 300,000 Arab American voters in Michigan, most of them concentrated in that county. And looking at the numbers just before we recorded, it looked like Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, got about 25,000, Cornel West about 5,000. That is not enough to make up the difference.
And he means in Michigan, because Jill Stein actually got 500,000 votes nationally.
Yes. I'm talking
tragically large.
I'm talking just Michigan here. But we're not just talking about the Arab American vote. And if you're interested in this, we've published a couple of really interesting articles on
Put a link in the show notes.
In Foreign Policy about this. But a lot of other voters, young voters, students at Michigan and Michigan State universities, in Ann Arbor and East Lansing, may have just stayed home, even if they didn't vote for the Green Party. There are some Arab Americans who openly said they were going to vote for Trump. That is a position that I would say is hard to justify, but it's something that figures into this equation too. So I think that if you want to make the case that foreign policy mattered anywhere, Michigan is the place where it may have actually flipped a state. But we'll have to look at the final numbers to see if it's enough to account for the difference between Harris and Trump.
I'll toss out another way in which foreign policy mattered. It mattered in the sense that Americans don't want to have these foreign wars, which bizarrely they perceive America having caused or Biden having presided over. So there is a very much anti-war and pro-isolationist sentiment, reminding me of the 1920s after World War I, whereby voters didn't grasp that they didn't actually get into World War I. World War I pulled them in. But people want to not be sending this money to Ukraine, and they don't want to be involved as the world's policeman. It's part of that arc from Afghanistan and Iraq to now, right? It's come full circle.
I think that is a fair reading. Again, I don't know how much of a driver it is, but I think it's in the air. So I think that what you're describing is sort of an atmospheric thing. I don't think we can put a finger on how many votes it shifted. But yeah, I think there's definitely a sense that we don't want any more of this. So yeah, there's resentment of the U.S. budget going towards weapons for Ukraine. I think there's also resentment of military aid to Israel, even among people who aren't particularly ideological on that issue. They see it as a financial thing. Why is the U.S. committing to this foreign war that we don't really care about? And so I think on the margins, yeah, I think a lot of people probably held that view. I just don't know if it determined their votes.
Although Americans may not care a lot about foreign policy, the rest of the world certainly cares about this American election. And there are countries whose leaders, like Saudi, UAE, Russia, Israel, have been pulling for Trump. And they've also been using the cover of the election to do various things. Most notably, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, fired his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, despite Israel arguably notching some of the greatest tactical successes in its history recently. This is something that I was quite surprised at, on the one hand, but not surprised because Netanyahu loves to oust his political opponents and knife them and get away with murder. So what is the meaning of this getting rid of Gallant?
I think Netanyahu wants to surround himself with loyalists, and Gallant has long been a thorn in his side. He's been a critic from inside the party. If you remember, about a year and a half ago, there's this major incident in Israel where he almost fired him, and it caused a firestorm of debate, and he backed off at the last minute, and Gallant stayed. This is before October 7th, before these latest wars, but that was a big deal. And now I think he's been one of the only checks on Netanyahu's more radical instincts, but also on Netanyahu's very radical right-wing coalition, without praising Gallant or trying to depict him as some sort of angel. I think that he was, to some extent, compared to the others in the Israeli political system, kind of a voice of reason within that administration. Without him, Netanyahu has more of a free hand. The question is, will his replacement be a check on Netanyahu in any respect, or just a rubber stamp?
It's funny to be praising, to some extent, a Likud hawk, but he had a degree of competence in wanting to act within the law. And I see this move as part of the general trend, which is that it's no longer about competence on the right wing. It's about ideological loyalty. And that'll be exactly the difference between the first Trump term and the second. He had, people like Milley, Rex Tillerson, and other non-ideological center-right people who brought a lot of life experience and competency. And now they're largely going to be purged for loyalists and ideologues, the Vivek Ramaswamy kind of vibe. And Netanyahu has long been ahead of the curve. In other words, his and Viktor Orban's neopopulism in Hungary, to my mind, antedated and was very much a wave of the future, which then Brexit and Trump later adopted and mirrored. So this movement with firing Golan? Could it foretell an expansion of the Middle East war?
Potentially. I mean, the night of the U.S. election is a good time to start a war or fire a minister or do something else dramatic. If you remember in 2020, the war between Ethiopia and Tigray began on election night, and that became one of the bloodiest wars of the century, perhaps the bloodiest so far. And so I wouldn't be surprised if things escalate.
I mean, I have a theory, which is that either way, Netanyahu was preparing to use this interregnum period, the lame duck Biden period, to score as many blows and get as many facts on the ground as he can, because either way, he's going to have many more severe checks on him.
Well, I'm not sure he will, though, with Trump coming in. I mean, I think that was his plan. If Harris had won, or if there was a drawn-out battle and recount lasting weeks, he wanted to get as much done as possible and cause as much destruction as possible in Lebanon and Gaza as he's been doing. He might not need to rush anymore. I mean, he's got his best buddy coming back to the White House now, which might give him all the time in the world to prosecute whatever wars he wants to, unless Trump surprises us and actually acts as a restraint on Netanyahu. But that's not something that I'm expecting.
Yes, it's a very disordering prospect. Sasha, it's been great chatting with you. Tell us for a few seconds about your very interesting Counterpoint podcast and how you tackle various issues there.
Yeah, so we just started this a few weeks ago, and the idea of Counterpoint is to bring together two experts on an issue, whether it's Israel, Iran, Ukraine, Brexit, and have them debate. And rather than just have a chat, a panel discussion, really put both people under the pressure of an opposing view. And I think we've had some pretty fiery debates. We've had some civil debates with strong disagreements on the nitty-gritty of policy, but that's what we're going for, is a proper debate on the key issues of the day facing policymakers around the world, and also not from a U.S.-centric perspective. I'm really trying to get guests from around the world.
Yeah, it's a good listen. It's well edited. And if you want to hear, for example, how Iran hawks who think that Israel and America should blow up the Iranian nuclear sites feel, and then if you want to hear about doves who feel we need to completely back off supporting Israel and we need to make sure that Iran isn't attacked, those different viewpoints are presented in your show. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes. And it's quite different than Disorder, where we lead to a conclusion. This show leaves it open. You have to decide yourself as these opposing arguments are presented.
Yes, maybe it creates even more disorder in the world, but a good debate is always a good listen.
I agree. And on that note, it's been great having you, Sasha, not only as a guest to remember this tragic and mournful day, but to have you on the pod to talk these things through with the mega orderers. We're going to now try to turn to a more upbeat view from our Glaswegian mega orderette-in-chief, Jane Kinninmont. Jane, is there anything to not be terrified about?
This election isn't the same kind of shock that it was in 2016. It is a different kind of shock. So it's still a shock, but it's one that I think Europeans have been preparing for, even if most Europeans would have preferred, obviously, a very, very different result. To some extent, it is a reality that Europe has got to deal with, and we've seen the European security debate already start to take account of that, people realizing slowly that they will not be living in the same kind of world where they can rely on American support. But that is much easier said than done. We all live with fundamental assumptions about how the world works that day to day we don't necessarily question. And for our generation and for our parents' generation that was born after the Second World War in Europe, it was a given that European security would be underpinned by the US, and that the US would also basically be underpinning international economic order.
Free trade.
With free trade. And of course, within Europe, there's different views about how aligned Europe should be with that. But the centre ground has been this assumption that that's the way that things are. And that is changing.
One might say the disorder has become enduring. I predicted it, and yet I was the most caught off guard by anyone about how I would feel. And I think that the question of having emotional intelligence is something that European leaders may not have had either. They knew this was coming, and what have they done to, create collective defense, or to have pooled money, or to have created the institutions to handle it? Very little, right, Jane?
One thing that has changed is that there are more European countries hitting the 2% of GDP defence spending target that NATO has proposed. But Trump has been very loudly taking credit for that. He's been saying that it's because of him that European leaders have woken up and done this, even though it's been an ongoing trend under Biden. But of course, a lot of it has also been in the too difficult box. It takes real leadership to get over European divisions, try to push forward a vision of what European defence looks like. There are some leading figures involved in this. Probably a key one is Ursula von der Leyen, a survivor in European politics who will remain extremely influential. And of course, Emmanuel Macron. But he is hamstrung by having become really quite unpopular at home.
Because we're in a situation where all incumbents become unpopular. Keir Starmer got unpopular within 100 days. He's barely an incumbent and he's unpopular. Trump's approval rating will crater as soon as he's in office. Just give it 100 or more days, and Trump's approval rating will be in a position that he can't win an election. So given that as soon as anyone is in office, they're unpopular, and the electorate wants things that can't be delivered, and they want them at a speed that modern bureaucracy can't achieve, how can the Europeans possibly fashion the kind of defense institutions that you mentioned?
There is an ongoing attempt across Europe to try to convince the public that defence spending really matters. And in many countries, probably including the UK, people are more interested in infrastructure and public services. There's only a few exceptions, which tend to be the countries physically closest to Russia. Finland would be a good example, the Baltic states.
Poland.
Absolutely, where they are feeling a sense of threat and they see the need to be spending more on defence. But that's very variable across Europe. So that's one of the areas of difference. And, there are very different views about where power lies within the EU. We now, of course, have a government in the UK that does want closer cooperation with the EU. And although the Starmer government will seek to work really, really closely with the US, this is going to up the ante. This is going to put more pressure for more serious defence and security cooperation.
Yeah, it may even cause the UK to have to kind of rejoin Europe when it comes to some defense and other trade issues, because there's no option anymore. But we've started out with a very what does this mean for Europe perspective. We've just had an American election. Before we talk about how disordering it is for the world, we need to talk about the disorder that this has unleashed on American politics. There's been a complete realignment. Before I share my thoughts on how the American electorate has realigned itself from traditional ideological lines, what are your views on what is the meaning of this realignment?
Well, it's super interesting to see that this isn't a rerun of 2016. And when we were looking at some of the predictions, there were a lot of predictions. Women will vote for Harris, even if they don't tell their husbands they're doing it. And predictions that very few ethnic minorities would vote for Trump. These things don't seem to have been borne out. It seems to have been more about economics and class politics. I mean, that's an oversimplification of a complex...
Just like fascism is about the lumpenproletariat. And we've seen a revenge of the lumpenproletariat, many of whom are blacks and Hispanics.
And there's an interesting thing that, left-wing parties also in parts of Europe, arguably in the UK, they've tended to take ethnic minority voters for granted to some extent because they expect them as minorities to be left-wing. But often there are large parts of those voter groups that are quite conservative when it comes to values. and also interested in free market, entrepreneurial, things like that. So that seems to be something that the Republicans have capitalized on quite smartly. And then there's also seemingly a short-term memory. Now you see Arab Americans, some of them seeming to buy the idea, well, Trump will bring peace in the Middle East.
Back to this realignment. You wrote me something earlier today as I'm trying to process all of this, which is that politics has been reorganized around economic and class politics and away from race and gender. I think that that's to some extent right, and the failure of the left's identity politics. Could you expand on that more?
So it seems from the exit polls that have been taking place and from interviews and reports that people are primarily saying they voted for Trump because of inflation and because of immigration. There were predictions that abortion would be much, much more of an issue. It seems not to have necessarily played out that way for Kamala Harris. And the vote hasn't divided neatly along racial lines, which frankly for the future of the society is probably a pretty good thing. But it does seem to be a sense that the Republicans are promising a better economy. Maybe that's based on some quite thin evidence. The fact that Trump himself is wealthy, the fact he can rally support from somebody like Elon Musk. He can point to some good economic stats during his time in office, but of course there was also COVID for a large part of that time and the economy was in a mess. But it seems to be the perception. But there's also a wider narrative about political elite. And although Trump himself obviously is a wealthy guy from New York, he plays the anti-elite card. He plays the guy who cuts through the establishment BS. He speaks the language of ordinary people, supposedly. And there can be that critique that the Democrats are patronising to the ordinary working class voter. And that does seem to be a perception problem that relates to class politics. And a lot of the debates that we're passionately interested in, they are couched in terms like the rules-based international order that doesn't mean anything to most people.
Sticking with the class politics aspect, it sounds like a different ordering, but I see it as a disordering because although Trump pitches himself to the forgotten man and he wins the poor in these rural areas, what he's delivering is an economy that favors the Elon Musks of the world and is going to be deregulation, and the markets are up, and Wall Street is very much a fan of all this deregulation and the AI companies and whatever. Is it not disordering and impossible to promise the kind of returns to these very elite and institutional investors and sectors like the tech sector and the AI sector, but then saying he's going to be helping the common man in the laboring economy? It can't possibly be true.
No, I mean, this is a classic example of the promises that are made on the campaign trail that probably won't be delivered on. Traditionally, the US has appeared to be a place where a lot of ordinary people had this belief in the so-called American dream that in a free market, the common man could prosper. But that, in this age of more global competition from China, inequality, this entrenched power of billionaires, etc., that doesn't seem to be plausible to that many people anymore. So I don't know how they've managed to marshal this hope that things will get better for the common man, except that when you're not the incumbent, you can promise a lot of things and people aren't feeling it now. And so some of them may feel, hey, a change will be the one to do it.
So I just hosted this watch party. You came to the tail end of it after the breakfast. And a lot of my European friends are being like, oh, it won't be that bad. Oh, don't worry. Couldn't get worse in the Middle East. And I'm sorry, this is the disorder program, and I think it will get worse. I think that this is worse than the 9/11. It's worse than Trump winning in 2016. It's worse than the October 7. It's worse than the tragedy in Gaza because it's higher order. Future humanitarian tragedies will flow out from this. This is at top of the pyramid, and then everything will ripple out. And millions of people will lose their homes, and millions of people will have a family member deported if they're from recent immigrant Latino communities. And then maybe whole populations will be transferred, whether it's in Sudan or Syria or Gaza. People are going to lose their homes. They're going to be bombed. And I just see everything that we feared in terms of disorder is come to fruition because Trump is going to be writing a blank check to every autocrat and every billionaire that they can do whatever they want so long as they transactionally deal with him and give him something that he wants. There's no proposal for an alternative order.
I think there are people in the Middle East who do take the view that things could not get worse because what the Biden administration has said that it's wanted has seemed quite far away from what is actually happening. And I imagine that if your family are in Gaza, then you would think the worst has already happened. But I think generally conflicts are more likely to get worse, to get better.
I'm going to take you to the lightning round, Jane. I'm going to ask you a series of questions inspired by our friend Nicholas Pelham of The Economist. A range of conflicts and issue areas, and you tell me how in 2028 they might look. Taiwan, might it be controlled by China?
Quite possible. There may be China hawks in this administration who will want Trump to look tough vis-a-vis China, but that is going to be focused on American economic wants and needs. The question of whether the US would put its extended deterrence on the line to defend Taiwan is more up in the air with Trump than it would be under a Harris administration, and China may well take advantage of that. Already, many people have said in the US that there's a 50% chance of China trying an invasion of Taiwan over the next few years. Probably that's more likely now.
Iran, what about the bombing of the nuclear sites, the bombing of the oil facilities, or some kind of attempt to either help the Israelis or allow the Israelis to pursue some scorched earth / regime change campaign there?
There's different scenarios here. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu was one of the first to congratulate Trump and has been very enthusiastic about his return, probably because he thinks that Trump would give him more leeway to take out Iran's nuclear program or key elements of it, maybe with some US support. Against that, Trump does not want to get stuck in a long war in the Middle East, so there's a balanced strike. And there could be an opportunity to pitch some kind of grand bargain deal with Iran to him, especially if that's something that the Saudis and the Emiratis, his good friends, would like to see happen. He would never go to the JCPOA, but if he had the idea that there was something bigger that might result in regional ceasefires and freeze Iran's nuclear program in return for some Israeli restraints, that could be interesting. I think it's an outside chance, but I think it's a thing worth exploring.
Essentially, if he can get a golf course in North Tehran that can be branded as the Trump International Tehran Golf Course, then he's willing to make a deal.
That would be a great element that has not been previously proposed.
Oh, I've been thinking about this. Continuing the lightning round, Ukraine, the Donbass. How do things look for our allies and friends there in Kyiv?
Broadly, it looks bad. Zelensky's obviously been thinking very hard about a Trump victory. He sent a long, thoughtful, congratulatory message to Trump saying, yes to your idea of peace through strength, and we should be stronger. He would like more support from Trump, but he's pitching that in terms of strengthening Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table. If there is an agreement, it would probably involve some kind of, even if not ceding territory, accepting for now a ceasefire that would leave Russia in control. And the big issue is who would guarantee that ceasefire? There has been talk about whether part of Ukraine could be accepted into NATO, but with the Trump administration, that seems even less likely than it was. There could well be a ceasefire that breaks down. It could be, ironically, when the next president comes into office, that Ukraine is flaring up into hot war yet again.
US-UK relations. There was this scandal that some labor activists had gone to North Carolina. A lot of good they did. And that there had been offers that they might have free places to stay, even though their plane tickets and other things were not comped, and they were not paid. And Trump became very angry, and his people said, Keir is interfering in our election. It's true that what he likes about the UK is the Queen and his golf courses and Scotland and stuff, but is there a risk that US-UK relations will be quite frosty and he will conduct them largely through farage rather than through official channels?
This is going to be a big worry for the Starmer government, which would obviously be much more comfortable with Harris, but they have also like others, been trying to woo the Trump camp in advance. David Lammy talking about the need for burden sharing, the UK being one of the 3 nuclear powers in NATO and probably expected to ramp up its defence spending and maintain its nuclear deterrent when the current defence review that we're having reports back. It was interesting when Lammy started talking about this, that Elbridge Colby, one of the China hawks who might be influential in the new administration, started saying how wonderful David Lammy was. I think there is a sense that there are certain buttons that any European government can press that will be welcomed by the Trump administration. And Trump, frankly, has forgiven his vice president for calling him Hitler. So it does seem he could let some water flow under the bridge as long as people are giving him what he wants in the present moment.
But isn't it about flattery? Because Kamala was extremely right. What he responds to is favor and flattery. If you saw him on the stage with his very bizarre acceptance speech where he completely did the weave and he looked very dour and no one smiled. Barron looked incredibly uncomfortable. Melania, her face is like plastered into that look with all the Botox. But then he had the UFC head on and he was like, he's a fighter. He's fought more for this country. He's a great leader. And Trump genuinely smiled. But for a brief moment, you saw, oh, he loves being flattered. That made him more happy than being up there on the stage addressing his supporters. Can Keir pull an initial Macron, and on his first state visit, like Macron did with his first state visit, just lay in on, some blokey humor and things they have in common and how impressed he is at this, that, and the other? Is there a chance for Keir to rehabilitate himself? Because it's not like they have a bad relationship. They have no relationship now.
There's always been attempts at bromance, whether it's David Cameron and Obama or, Bush and Blair.
Those were actually successful.
Keir doesn't have the natural chumminess of a Boris Johnson or a Nigel Farage. But the relationship is so important. There'll be heavy leaning into special relationship. We're spending the money on defence and we are your friends in all sorts of ways. To me, the question is particularly about, where will they pick their battles when they do disagree? Because Ukraine is going to be one of the early ones. The UK has been one of the top supporters of Ukraine. Can it keep doing that if Trump's view is that he wants the conflict to be wrapped up as soon as possible and that he's going to sort things out with Putin? I think the UK is extremely worried about this.
And I think the UK needs to exert a mega ordering role because no one else is going to do global leadership on Ukraine. It's not going to be Trump. And Macron has his own agenda and interests. So is it possible that Keir can be a foil to Trump?
I think the UK will work really closely with Eastern European countries to try hard to lobby Trump to support Ukraine. I think they will appeal to his ego. They will say to him, watch out, Putin could be taking you as a fool. You don't want him to think you're weak. They'll use all that kind of language. But I just think it's going to be difficult because I think even the Biden administration was relatively limited in its patience on Ukraine. They just don't see it as a central American interest in the way that Europeans see it as a European interest. And I think it does point us towards a world where people are more conscious of the idea of their own backyard and taking care of their own problems. But then, what if we do have an administration full of China hawks that want Britain and other countries to come and be helpful in the Indo-Pacific? But if Europe is feeling left to its own devices, will Europe then side with the US if there are serious tensions with China? We could just see a world that's more regionally fragmented and more parochial.
Yes, neopopulism is, to my mind, a new kind of neo-localism. By saying America first and then Britain first, and we deal with us first, people are going to be parochial in their concerns, as you pointed out, but they're also going to be in these quasi-regional ideological blocks without doing the global ordering that's necessary. And I see this as meaning the coordination failures that I've been writing about and talking about for nearly a decade now will get worse. It's going to be very, very difficult to coordinate on AI and climate change. Or is there some hope that Trump is just going to make a decree and that will become the standard?
It's already hard to coordinate on AI and climate change. We seem to have every group of governments that exists trying to create their own AI standards. But essentially, a lot of it is left to what the US is willing to implement because the key companies are in the US. Elon Musk may be influential here. There'll probably be an argument that innovation must push forward and regulations should be very, very light touch.
What I think we're going to see, and Elon's role is going to very much mediate this, is the consolidation of Uber monopolies. Uber monopolies in the AI space, in the healthcare space, like we talked about with Jamie Metzel. These things are so capital intensive. They require not only so much data, but electricity and silicon chips, and then also people in different hubs and nodes, not just for the programming, but for the allocation of resources and various connections, that it will lend towards natural monopolies if not regulated. And I believe that that regulation is necessary. But if Elon is just delegated to this, what do you know? Him and his buddies may become absolutely unassailable giants because you'd need 4 trillion and a first mover advantage to get there. And no one else has the 4 trillion, and Elon already has the first mover advantage. So if you want a corporatist world, I see that as a kind of order. But what we know about capitalism is that it's not ordering. It's that kind of Hayekian and Schumpeterian creative destruction, that things are just going to be destroying. And then I think also inshitifying, because once these monopolies have captured their customer and consumer, they don't have to deliver any services. They have no competition. The chance of regulating Facebook or X now is 0.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I do think this role of Elon Musk in the election, the fact that Trump talked and talked and talked about him, that is a steep sign of the times. And Elon is only the most visible manifestation of it. These are incredibly powerful individuals with essentially no accountability.
I had promised the listeners there would be some very light Celtic optimism. I'm not sure that I've heard it.
I'm sorry, that should always be my role. But unlike you, I have managed to get 3 hours of strategic sleep between about 11:30 and about 3. So
I should be
I'm
so jealous.
much
That's
happier
amazing.
than you.
Yeah.
I just think I am seeing it from a slightly different place than you, just because of having lived through British politics in recent years. We have seen profound realignments. I was having this weird deja vu hearing about the smashing through the blue wall, and I was thinking about the building of the red wall and the smashing of the red wall, which were terms we used in UK politics, where our colours, of course, are reversed and red is Labour, and it just seemed so familiar. We did see a huge realignment of politics around Brexit. We have seen that the traditional basis of the political party, where you had a Labour Party for the working class and a Conservative Party that tried to conserve institutions and traditions, that has completely gone. Those parties represent completely different things. But it's been a state of flux that right now has come back to a very centrist type of politics. And people have got fatigued with the disruption. They have got fatigued with identity politics. Whatever your views on Scottish independence, I think if they had another indie ref right now, people would just not want more disruption because they are a bit tired and they would like to get on with stuff. And they'd love to have a government that sorts out your ability to get a doctor's appointment and, even better, make the trains work and make the price of a train ticket vaguely comprehensible. These are the things people care about.
I understand that there's a kind of optimism there, which is that you think that the right with Brexit was shown to not deliver for the NHS, to not deliver the economic growth that it promised post-Brexit. But Trump already had a term. He didn't deliver and he got reelected. Does this mean that the American electorate needs to see him fail again and more wildly, see the tariffs cause the worst recession that we've had since World War II? Or what would constitute something that could cause that realignment?
Super interesting that they seem to think that he broadly succeeded in keeping inflation in check, maintaining security, and having no wars on his watch, as he would put it. It does seem to be based on a sense that life isn't as good now for those people who voted for him, which obviously is just over half, and the country's quite divided about it. But a lot of your questions about how much does this determine the course of the future, these are going to play out now. We've already got a very conservative Supreme Court. What is going to happen to other institutions, and what is the lasting effect of that going to be? 4 years is one thing. The extent to which there'll be lasting reshaping of institutions is probably the biggest worry that people have that are concerned about what happens to US democracy. And in the UK, the institutions of state held up quite well through the Brexit crisis. The fact that the Supreme Court was able to rule that a Prime Minister had broken the law was an indication that there were still those checks.
Yeah, but we don't have that in the States. The Supreme Court has ruled that the president is essentially immune, not only from more prosecutions, but from doing any wrong. He can now use the military to attack and destroy his enemies. And he can, in his official capacity, essentially violate the Constitution. So now that he's surrounded by loyalists, I just don't see how those checks and balances play out in the U.S. case. I mean, I obviously think that Vance will be the next president. It's going to be, maybe he'll die in 2 years, or maybe Vance will just be essentially anointed at the end of his term. I don't understand how he can get punished for his failure, because Westminster to some extent works, and there were real votes. I don't see there being real votes here in America. I see an urbanization that will take time, of course, but the cowing of the media, the threatening of journalists, the movement of so much news onto social media that is fake and presenting a propagandistic view of things. I don't see how we get out of this. And I mean, it's true. It's only been 6 hours that I've fully grasped, and about 8 hours that we've been in the second Trump era. But I feel that I've fallen into this very, very deep abyss. And I'm wondering if you will join me, Jane, in running for the hills of Hampstead. They're not so far. We can run to the hills of Hampstead. I thought we could just like hang out there, but I think now we're going to need to have a shovel, and we're going to burrow underneath them, and we're going to hide. And I'd like to say wake me in 2028, but maybe just don't wake me at all.
We've got some very nice small mountains in Scotland, Jason, if you want to come a bit further afield. But I think there's a Trump golf course there.
Yeah, this Trump golf course and my knee injury, I don't know if I can like make it to get to these mountains. I can easily run, even in my quasi-crippled condition, to get to these hills of Hampstead. Will I be safe there?
This is the thing. This is the inescapable election. It does affect the whole world, and obviously most of us have absolutely no say in that. And what Europeans are going to be thinking about in the coming weeks is how much agency do we have in international politics? And can we get a bit more agency by moving away from constantly being divided over seemingly everything?
Europeans need their agency. Americans need some agency. And I have agency. We are going to end this podcast and run for the hills of Hampstead. Omega orderers, I commiserate with you. I feel your pain as an orderer-in-chief. And I'm really, 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 really sorry. I'm sorry. Those of us who try to shape opinion and who try to push for sensible policies and learn foreign languages, we've failed, and we need to take a mea culpa. I haven't had a great impact, but the tiny impact that I've tried to have has had no effect. And all these other pundits and experts in the media, we should be saying we've failed. And those who are at the top of the chain who told Biden that he could stay on as his cognitive health was declining, and others who said that we shouldn't have an open primary, that it was fine for Kamala to take over, she had momentum. I want to see those guys who are really responsible falling on their swords. And as they fall on their swords, we can have a purging, because we can't just continue like this. We need honor and real taking of responsibility on the center and the left. And I think we're unlikely to get that accountability, but it would be a nice start. And I think ordering could come out of those who've made these ham-fisted decisions, falling on their own bloody swords, exiting public life, and allowing a new generation with bolder and broader visions to come and step up to the mantle of global ordering. Well, on that note, we don't want you, my dear listeners, to fall on your swords. We would, however, like you to subscribe to the Substack. A lot of ordering is going to be going on there. The link is in the show notes. Jane has shared some interesting thoughts in this week's Substack. You can have links to Sasha's book and his podcast. And we're going to be obviously following up on this election theme for quite some time. There's so much to discuss, and I think that it's something that we actually need to sleep on and reflect on. So it's time to thank our producer, George McDonough, our executive producer, Neil Fern. I'm wishing you not an orderly week, because it's not going to be an orderly week, but I hope it's a week of some pathos, and know that I feel your pain, and it's nice that we have this kind of parasocial relationship by having this pod and knowing that people care about me and think about these things similarly and care what I think and feel. It's helping me through this very difficult and personal time. So chin up, try to be good to your friends and parents and kids, and, put one foot in front of the other and do what you love and go to yoga class and read a book, and I'll talk to you next week.